From the moment of birth, we are thrown into a world we never chose, a world of suffering, struggle, and fleeting pleasure. We spend our lives seeking meaning, yet no one ever asked if we wanted to participate in this existence. This is the foundation of antinatalism, the belief that bringing new life into the world is a moral wrong. But why? And if we had the choice, would non-existence have been the better option? To exist is to suffer. This assertion is not only central to Buddhist philosophy, but also evident in the experience of every living being. Hunger, disease, fear, and inevitable loss are universal constants. Arthur Schopenhauer famously argued that life is not a gift, but a cruel joke played on the individual. He saw existence as characterized by an incessant striving which, even when rewarded with brief pleasure, ultimately leads to frustration, pain, and dissatisfaction. Desire is endless. Fulfill one craving and another arises. Escape one pain and a new one emerges. The moments of joy we cling to are mere interruptions in a relentless cycle of need and disappointment. If suffering is guaranteed, what right does anyone have to impose it on a being that never consented to it? If autonomy is the foundation of morality, what greater violation exists than forcing someone into life without their permission? No one consents to being born. We are all thrust into existence blindly, left to endure whatever suffering life inflicts upon us. Philosopher David Benatar expands this idea through his asymmetry argument. According to Benatar, not being born is never harmful because a non-existent being cannot suffer. Yet, being born inevitably results in suffering and the risk of extreme harm. Therefore, he concludes, it is always better never to have been. The asymmetry argument rests on the idea that the absence of pain is always good, even when there is no one to enjoy that good. Conversely, the absence of pleasure is not bad unless there is someone who is deprived of that pleasure. By this logic, bringing a child into existence introduces harm where none existed before. Some argue that life contains joys, love, beauty, achievement. But are these sufficient justification for the vast amounts of suffering existence imposes? The pleasure experienced by some does not negate the immense suffering experienced by others. Even if pleasure were evenly distributed, the very nature of pain's intensity and persistence undermines the value of those brief moments of joy. Pleasure is fleeting, whereas suffering often lingers. For every moment of happiness, countless moments of pain, boredom, and despair fill the spaces in between. If life's good moments demand enduring immense suffering, is it worth it? And even if it is for some, does that justify imposing life on another being who might not be so fortunate? If bringing a child into the world guarantees suffering, does that not render procreation an act of cruelty? The decision to have children is rarely framed as an ethical issue, yet it may be one of the most profound moral choices a person can make. Imagine a world where no one procreates. The cycle of suffering ends. No new beings are forced to endure hunger, disease, war, or heartbreak. Antinatalism contends that this outcome is not only ideal but a moral imperative. Opponents of antinatalism often claim that life possesses inherent meaning, that even suffering has purpose. Love, art, and human connection are presented as proof that existence is worthwhile. Yet, this argument presupposes that meaning is inherent rather than constructed. Existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre asserted that existence precedes essence, implying that meaning is something we create, not something given. But if meaning must be constructed, does that justify imposing the struggle of constructing meaning upon another being who never asked for it? While antinatalism posits that life's suffering is inherently unjustified, existentialist thinkers like Sartre and Nietzsche present a counter-argument. Suffering is not only inevitable, but essential to the construction of meaning. Friedrich Nietzsche famously declared, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger." From this perspective, suffering is not a harm to be avoided, but a trial to be embraced. However, Nietzsche's approach to suffering is grounded in the belief that hardship serves as a catalyst for growth, creativity, and self-overcoming. The antinatalist critique of Nietzsche's philosophy would point out that while the ability to transform suffering into strength may be admirable, it is not a universal possibility. Not all suffering leads to growth. Some pain is simply destructive. Chronic illness, psychological torment, poverty, These are not mere obstacles to be overcome, but conditions that can obliterate the individual's capacity for fulfillment. Moreover, Nietzsche's idea of embracing suffering presupposes a conscious desire to do so. Forcing existence upon someone who may not share that desire is a violation of their autonomy. The value Nietzsche places upon suffering as a tool for growth is only relevant if the individual has chosen to pursue that growth. Albert Camus, another existentialist, presented a different approach to the problem of suffering. In his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus argues that life is fundamentally absurd, devoid of inherent meaning or purpose. For Camus, the struggle itself is what grants life value. By embracing the absurd, one can create their own meaning, even in a world indifferent to their existence. However, the anti-natalist might respond that the need to construct meaning from suffering highlights the fundamental cruelty of existence. If life requires one to grapple with meaninglessness and suffering simply to make it bearable, is that not evidence of its inherent flaw? For Camus, rebellion against the absurd is an act of personal courage, but from the anti-natalist perspective, imposing the necessity of such rebellion upon another being is ethically questionable. Antinatalism's emphasis on consent aligns with certain principles of Kantian ethics. According to Immanuel Kant, individuals should be treated as ends in themselves, never merely as means. Procreation, in the antinatalist view, treats the child as a means to fulfill the desires or purposes of the parent without consideration of the child's autonomy. While Kant himself did not address antinatalism, his emphasis on autonomy and respect for rational agents supports the antinatalist critique. To force existence upon someone who cannot consent is to disregard their intrinsic worth as an autonomous being. However, Kantian ethics also places great emphasis on duty and the development of moral character. Critics might argue that by choosing not to procreate, individuals are neglecting their duty to contribute to the development of future generations. This counter-argument, however, presumes that the act of creation itself is a moral good, a presumption antinatalism fundamentally challenges. One of the most significant criticisms of antinatalism is that its arguments, if accepted, would lead to societal and cultural stagnation. Human civilization has been built upon the foundation of reproduction, growth, and continuity. Families, communities, and nations have all been structured around the assumption that the continuation of the species is a fundamental good. Cultural traditions, religious doctrines, and social expectations all reinforce the idea that creating new life is a positive and necessary endeavor. To reject this principle is to challenge not only personal beliefs, but deeply entrenched social systems. Antinatalism, therefore, is often met with resistance not only on philosophical grounds, but on cultural and emotional ones. From an environmental standpoint, antinatalism raises compelling concerns. The ongoing growth of the human population has led to ecological destruction, resource depletion, and widespread suffering among non-human animals. Industrialization, urban expansion, and the exploitation of natural resources are all driven, at least in part, by the constant need to accommodate an ever-increasing human population. Environmental antinatalism argues that refraining from procreation is not only an ethical decision concerning potential human suffering, but also a moral imperative to reduce harm inflicted upon the planet and other species. Every new human life adds to the strain on ecosystems already under tremendous pressure. Furthermore, the notion of consent remains relevant even in ecological discussions. Non-human animals do not consent to the destruction of their habitats, the pollution of their environments, or the systematic exploitation inflicted upon them by human societies. To perpetuate the cycle of human existence without addressing the harm it causes to the natural world is a profound ethical failure. Antinatalism's ethical critique of existence extends beyond the individual and encompasses societal structures, cultural values, and ecological concerns. It forces us to question whether the act of bringing new life into the world can be justified when it contributes to suffering not only for the individual being born, but for countless other sentient beings affected by human activity. The broader implications of antinatalism also raise questions about the nature of morality itself. Should ethical principles be applied universally, or should they be tailored to suit the particularities of human existence? Is it morally permissible to prioritize the interests of existing beings over potential beings? And if suffering is to be minimized, how far should that imperative extend? The practical implications of antinatalism are vast and complex. While philosophical arguments may resonate with some, the societal structure built around reproduction makes widespread adoption of antinatalism unlikely. However, even if antinatalism remains a minority view, its principles can influence ethical behavior and cultural attitudes. One of the most immediate implications of antinatalism is its challenge to conventional family structures. The expectation that individuals will eventually marry and have children is deeply embedded in many cultures. Antinatalism questions this expectation, encouraging individuals to reconsider their assumptions about parenthood and the moral responsibilities associated with creating life. This reconsideration can lead to profound social and economic consequences. If fewer people choose to procreate, societies may face demographic shifts characterized by aging populations and shrinking workforces. Such changes could have significant implications for social welfare systems, healthcare infrastructure, and economic growth. Additionally, antinatalism raises ethical concerns about the treatment of existing life. While it primarily addresses the morality of bringing new life into existence, it also encourages greater attention to the suffering already present in the world. If the goal is to reduce harm, then efforts to alleviate existing suffering become paramount. From this perspective, antinatalism intersects with other ethical movements, including animal rights advocacy, environmental preservation, and humanitarian efforts. By emphasizing the reduction of suffering, antinatalism aligns itself with broader concerns about exploitation, cruelty, and inequality. Moreover, antinatalism presents a challenge to concepts of legacy and purpose. For many, the desire to procreate is linked to a sense of meaning derived from contributing to future generations. Antinatalism questions whether this motivation is ethically justified, particularly if the act of creation results in harm. This critique extends to societal narratives about progress, achievement, and immortality. Beyond the philosophical and cultural realms, antinatalism also invites questions about political and legal frameworks. If antinatalism were to gain widespread acceptance, what might this mean for policies concerning reproduction, social welfare, and education? Should governments actively discourage procreation, or would such measures violate personal freedoms? Some antinatalists advocate for a libertarian approach, arguing that individuals should be free to make their own reproductive choices, provided they are fully informed about the ethical implications. Others propose more interventionist measures, such as financial incentives for voluntary sterilization or educational campaigns aimed at reducing birth rates. At the extreme end of the spectrum, movements like the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement, VEMT, advocate for the complete cessation of human reproduction as a means of eliminating suffering. While such proposals are unlikely to gain mainstream acceptance, they highlight the extent to which antinatalism challenges conventional ethical and political paradigms. Furthermore, antinatalism raises difficult questions about reproductive rights. Should the right to procreate be considered absolute, or are there circumstances in which it can be ethically restricted? For example, if procreation contributes to environmental destruction or perpetuates systemic injustices, should it be subject to moral scrutiny or even legal regulation? The intersection of antinatalism with political theory remains underexplored, but is crucial for understanding the broader implications of the philosophy. Issues of justice, rights, and collective responsibility are all implicated in debates about the morality of bringing new life into the world. Given its radical implications, antinatalism is often misunderstood or dismissed as a nihilistic or misanthropic philosophy. Critics frequently characterize antinatalists as being motivated by despair, bitterness, or a hatred of humanity. However, this interpretation overlooks the fact that many antinatalists are driven by compassion and a desire to prevent suffering. Additionally, antinatalism is sometimes conflated with suicide advocacy or an outright rejection of all forms of life. This misconception arises from a failure to distinguish between the decision not to create new life and the desire to end existing life. Most antinatalists do not advocate for harm against those who already exist. Rather, they seek to prevent harm from occurring in the first place. Antinatalism also faces criticism from proponents of human exceptionalism, who argue that human beings possess unique qualities that justify the continuation of the species. The capacity for creativity, empathy, and intellectual inquiry is often cited as evidence that human existence has inherent value. However, antinatalism challenges the assumption that exceptional traits necessarily justify existence. Even if humanity possesses qualities that are rare or unique, this does not negate the ethical concerns associated with suffering and consent. The fact that human beings are capable of producing art, philosophy, or scientific discovery does not eliminate the pain and injustice experienced by countless individuals. Moreover, antinatalism prompts a re-evaluation of the relationship between human beings and the natural world. While traditional ethics often prioritize human interests, antinatalism emphasizes a more inclusive approach that considers the well-being of all sentient beings. This perspective has implications for environmental ethics, animal rights, and broader considerations of ecological justice. One of the most powerful objections to antinatalism is the idea that life, despite its suffering, can be meaningful. Proponents of existentialism, humanism, and religious worldviews often argue that meaning is something that individuals can create, discover, or experience. Antinatalism, however, questions whether the potential for meaning justifies the certainty of suffering. If meaning is something that must be constructed rather than discovered, then the process of constructing meaning may itself be fraught with pain, confusion, and frustration. Furthermore, antinatalism challenges the assumption that the pursuit of meaning is inherently valuable. From a purely ethical standpoint, the desire to find or create meaning may be insufficient to justify imposing existence upon another being. The search for meaning, while meaningful to those who engage in it, may still be considered a fundamentally personal endeavor that cannot be ethically imposed upon others. Antinatalism invites reflection on whether meaning is truly an objective good or merely a subjective experience. If meaning is something that individuals impose upon their own lives, then its value may be contingent upon individual preferences rather than universal ethical principles. Some argue that the ability to create meaning is precisely what makes existence valuable. From this perspective, the struggle to overcome adversity and develop a sense of purpose is itself a meaningful pursuit. This argument, however, does not address the ethical concerns associated with forcing that struggle upon an unwilling participant. Ultimately, the question of meaning remains a central point of contention in debates surrounding antinatalism. Whether or not life is worth creating depends not only on the presence or absence of suffering, but also on the perceived value of meaning, creativity, and personal fulfillment. From a cosmological perspective, some antinatalists have pointed to the ultimate fate of the universe as an argument against procreation. If all life is destined to perish, whether through heat death, cosmic collapse, or some other apocalyptic event, then the pursuit of life and meaning may be seen as ultimately futile. This cosmic pessimism, as articulated by thinkers such as Thomas Ligotti, challenges the notion that life possesses enduring value. Evolutionary ethics offers a counter-argument to antinatalism by suggesting that moral instincts themselves are products of evolution. From this perspective, the desire to protect one's offspring, nurture communities, and promote human flourishing are all rooted in adaptive behaviors that enhance survival. However, antinatalism challenges the assumption that adaptation and survival are inherently good. If evolution favors traits that perpetuate suffering, then simply appealing to evolutionary origins cannot serve as a moral justification. Furthermore, antinatalism raises the possibility that moral systems themselves may be biased by evolutionary imperatives. If our ethical frameworks are designed to promote survival rather than well-being, then they may be insufficient for addressing the deeper questions raised by antinatalism. Modern antinatalism has evolved into various branches and interpretations. Philosophical antinatalism, as articulated by thinkers like Benatar, focuses on logical and ethical arguments surrounding suffering and consent. Environmental antinatalism emphasizes the harm inflicted upon the planet and non-human animals through continued human reproduction. Moreover, some advocates of antinatalism frame their arguments through the lens of social justice. The inequalities inherent in human society, poverty, discrimination, and exploitation, can be seen as further reasons to question the morality of bringing new beings into existence. Despite its controversial nature, antinatalism continues to attract interest from philosophers, activists, and thinkers who are concerned with the ethical implications of existence. Whether viewed as a compassionate response to suffering or a pessimistic rejection of life, antinatalism remains a provocative and enduring philosophical perspective. Furthermore, the notion of consent remains relevant even in ecological discussions. Non-human animals do not consent to the destruction of their habitats, the pollution of their environments, or the systematic exploitation inflicted upon them by human societies. To perpetuate the cycle of human existence without addressing the harm it causes to the natural world is a profound ethical failure. One of the most enduring challenges to antinatalism comes from religious perspectives. Religious traditions, particularly Abrahamic faiths like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, often challenge antinatalism by emphasizing the sanctity of life, divine will, and moral duty to procreate. In Genesis, the command to be fruitful and multiply is framed as a divine imperative, while life itself is viewed as a sacred gift from a higher power. Many religious doctrines see suffering as meaningful, whether as a test of faith, a path to enlightenment, or a vehicle for redemption. Christianity, for instance, regards the suffering of Jesus Christ as redemptive, implying suffering can have transformative value. Antinatalism challenges these frameworks by questioning whether religious beliefs about purpose or redemption can ethically justify bringing new beings into a world where suffering is inevitable. The central argument is that existence guarantees suffering, and imposing life without consent is morally objectionable, regardless of spiritual benefits. Antinatalism prioritizes harm prevention, suggesting that non-existence precludes suffering altogether. Religious concepts of duty or divine will often clash with antinatalist ethics, which argue that minimizing suffering should be the highest moral priority. If a compassionate God values the alleviation of suffering, then creating beings destined to suffer seems contradictory. Even if life offers moments of joy, antinatalism argues that the absence of suffering in non-existence outweighs any potential benefits. Ultimately, antinatalism disputes the religious assertion of life's intrinsic value, viewing it as contingent upon subjective experiences. If suffering is unavoidable, the supposed value of life becomes questionable. By framing non-existence as preferable to involuntary suffering, antinatalism presents a moral challenge to religious traditions that prioritize procreation and view suffering as inherently valuable. In the end, the debate over antinatalism is not merely an abstract philosophical exercise. It is a conversation about compassion, responsibility, and the ways in which we choose to interact with the world. Whether one embraces or rejects its conclusions, antinatalism forces us to confront difficult questions about what it means to live ethically and how best to reduce the suffering that so often defines existence. The discussion is far from over. But if antinatalism achieves nothing else, it serves as a powerful reminder that the act of creating life is a decision of immense ethical significance, one that deserves to be approached with the utmost care, humility, and compassion.